My name is Frederica Bebenza, and I'm very honored to be chairing this session with Professor Michael Rothberg this morning. In light of the conversations we've been having over the last couple of days, I thought, why don't we take a minute to silently just have a look around the room and give each other some eye contact, a smile, quietly, silently. I think we probably need to do a little bit more of that as the next 2 days unfold. I think Michael Rothberg does not need much introduction. I think you're sitting amongst kindred spirits in this room, Michael. But nonetheless, I'd like to just tell those of you who are unfamiliar with him and his work a little bit about him. Prof. Rothberg is the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies and is Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. His latest book is called The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, which is being published by Stanford University Press in their Cultural Memory in the Present series and is hopefully going to be coming out next year. Previous books, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, include Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, which was published in 2009, Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation, published in 2000, and co-edited with Neil Levi, The Holocaust Theoretical Readings, 2003. And he's published with Yasemin Yildiz, presently undergoing Inheritance, Trouble, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance for Fordham University Press. He's got a really fascinating presentation. I think I've heard snippets of it. He brings in the fantastic William Kentridge, but I'm not going to sneak preview anything more. Please, Prof. Rothberg.
Good morning. Thank you, Frederica, for the kind introduction, for setting the stage. I'm, of course, very, very grateful to Pumla Gobodo-Marikezela for inviting me to be part of this incredible event, as I'm grateful to Teresa and Landy and all the other people who have helped to make this possible. It's really an honor to be here, and very, very moving as well. It's my first time in South Africa, so I should probably start with a long list of disclaimers. But if I did that, I think we'd have no more time at all for discussion. So instead, I'm just going to say what I have to say, and I'm going to hope that it contributes to the discussion that has been opened up in and around the conference. And I will be speaking from sections from my forthcoming book called The Implicated Subject. How can violent histories and actualities find redress? All forms of restitution prove incommensurable with the brute facts of injury, death, and dispossession. And as time passes, questions of responsibility also tend to grow more tenuous or more tangled. Despite such dilemmas of historical justice, however, redress remains imperative in cases where irrevocable traumatic pasts continue to echo in, imprint, and interrupt the present. Without neglecting such questions of commensurability and temporality, I will argue today that the aftermaths of violence demand that we address a third problem as well, the question of subjectivity. The debates and struggles that ensue over the terms of reparation in the wake of violence usually take place in a context structured by a discourse of victims and perpetrators. As Elazar Barkin writes at the beginning of his landmark book, The Guilt of Nations, published in 2000, quote, "The novelty of the global discourse of restitution is that it is a discussion between the perpetrators and their victims. This interaction between perpetrator and victim is a new form of political negotiation that enables the rewriting of memory and historical identity in ways that both can share," unquote. Yet, although the discourse of restitution emerges necessarily out of a history defined by perpetrators and victims, that binary language of subjectivity is inadequate, and for at least two reasons. First, few collectives involved in the granting or receiving of restitution possess the homogenized membership implied by the terms victims and perpetrators. The scope of restitution cases for collective historical injustice necessarily transgresses the limits of such simplified identity categories and comes to include subjects who are neither victims nor perpetrators, but are still somehow caught up in the events at stake. In drawing attention to such gray zones of restitution, I am naturally not implying that we should halt efforts at reparation or downplay the guilt of perpetrators, but rather that we should open up a conceptual terrain in which participation and membership might join perpetration and victimization as salient terms. Second, to the extent that a negotiated form of restitution is not achieved, an injustice persists across time, even across generations. There is a diachronic dimension to participation in a group that must be factored in. While injustices bleed across periods, the future generations related genealogically to the original injustice are not easily categorized as victims and perpetrators in many cases. Furthermore, even the language of future generations can be misleading. Many contemporary subjects facing the legacies of the past have no genealogical connection to the events at issue because they or their families immigrated into histories of injustice. In seeking to shed some light on these dilemmas of subjectivity, I draw in my forthcoming book The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators. My book emerges from a belief that our accounts of power, privilege, trauma, and violence suffer from an underdeveloped vocabulary. In particular, we lack adequate concepts for describing the indirect, structural, and historical forms of responsibility that enable and perpetuate injury, exploitation, and domination, but that frequently remain in the shadows. As a contribution to such understanding, I offer the category of the implicated subject and the related notion of implication. Derived from the Latin stem implicare, meaning to entangle, involve, and connect closely, implication, like the proximate but not identical term complicity, draws attention to how we are folded into, implicated in, events that at first seem beyond our agency as individual subjects. In contrast to complicity, however, implication lies outside of legal jurisdiction and involves less direct forms of causality. Implicated subjects occupy positions aligned with power and privilege without being themselves direct agents of harm. They contribute to, inhabit, inherit, or benefit from regimes of domination, but do not originate or control such regimes. An implicated subject is neither a victim nor a perpetrator, but rather a participant in a social formation in which the positions of victim and perpetrator are possible, even likely, and yet in which most people do not occupy such clear-cut roles. Less actively involved than perpetrators, implicated subjects do not fit the mold of the passive bystander either. Although indirect or belated, their actions and inactions help produce and reproduce the positions of victims and perpetrators. In other words, implicated subjects help propagate the legacies of historical violence and prop up the structures of inequality that mark the present. Modes of implication, entanglement in historical and present-day injustices are complex, multifaceted, and sometimes contradictory, but are nonetheless essential to confront in the pursuit of recognition, reparation, and reconciliation. In the remainder of my talk, I will first evoke some of the thinkers who have helped me conceptualize the implicated subject before turning to two case studies. In order to explore entangled forms of historical and contemporary implication, I will focus first and briefly on a long-term aesthetic project of the Jewish South African artist William Kentridge, and then in a more extended way on an example of social media activism that confronted impunity for racial violence in the United States following the murder of Trayvon Martin. Both Kentridge and the Trayvon Martin Project suggest that if we want to understand and confront collective violence, we need to account both for the gray zones of political responsibility and the distinct clarity of perpetration and victimization. I am not suggesting, in other words, that implication should constitute the sole horizon of the political. I do, however, want to defend the necessity of an impure politics engaged with implication. Such a politics would not be based in the first instance on a shared vulnerability and precarity, as many theorists have recently argued, but rather on a self-reflexive grasp of our unequal insertion into the machinery of violence. Although I believe we've lacked an overarching term to describe the types of implication we confront in a violent and unequal world, I draw on a range of thinkers in formulating my account. In addition to those who have in recent years focused attention on the beneficiary, on complicity, on structural injustice, and on post-memory, I find inspiration in such diverse sources as intersectional feminism, which first mapped the complexity of the social that lies at the heart of implication, and post-Holocaust theorists of responsibility and judgment. In this latter tradition, Primo Levi's notion of the gray zone, Karl Jaspers' distinction between varieties of guilt, criminal, political, moral, and metaphysical, Simona Forti's account of mediocre as opposed to demonic evil, and above all, Hannah Arendt's 1960s writings on personal and collective responsibility helped me forge a new approach to implication, subjectivity, and solidarity. In her lecture, Collective Responsibility from 1968, Arendt is at pains to distinguish something like what Jaspers called criminal guilt, which she had come to see as essential for holding perpetrators responsible for their actions, from forms of collective responsibility, which are related to what Jaspers called political guilt. Unlike criminal guilt, which for Arendt and Jaspers is strictly individual and involves direct forms of causality, collective responsibility does not derive primarily from personal characteristics, but rather from our nature as social beings. As Arendt writes in a passage that I also take as the epigraph for my book, this vicarious responsibility for things we have not done, this taking upon ourselves the consequences for things we are entirely innocent of, is the price we pay for the fact that we live our lives not by ourselves, but among our fellow men, and that the faculty of action, which after all is the political faculty par excellence, can be actualized only in one of the many and manifold forms of community. Since we live in the company of others, Arendt's approach suggests our models of responsibility and political action must move beyond the assumptions of liberal legal culture with its emphasis on individualized guilt and innocence, and consider instead what it means to act collectively, which also means indirectly and at a distance, both for good and for bad. Like my notion of implication, Arendt's account of responsibility has both synchronic and diachronic dimensions, that is, dimensions relating both to the present and the past. She finds dilemmas of responsibility simultaneously in the everyday forms of complicity that enable totalitarian rule and in the aftermath of historical events. On the synchronic present-day side, she describes what she calls personal responsibility under dictatorship in an essay of that name. Whoever participates in public life at all, regardless of party membership or membership in the elite formations of the regime, is implicated in one way or another in the deeds of the regime as a whole, unquote. To illustrate diachronic historical responsibility, she uses the example of Napoleon assuming France's history and states, somewhat ironically, "We are always held responsible for the sins of our fathers as we reap the rewards of their merits, but we are of course not guilty of their misdeeds, either morally or legally, nor can we ascribe their deeds to our own merits." Although not guilty of what precedes us or unfolds around us, we remain captive to personal implication and communal responsibility by virtue of our participation in collective ways of life. An approach based on implication and implicated subjects can help illuminate a wide range of social and political struggles. For example, the workings of contemporary capitalism at a global scale depend on relations of exploitation that systematically produce inequality and climate catastrophe, as well as psychic and physical harm. Privileged consumers in the global north are not, however, best described as perpetrators of exploitation and environmental degradation, but rather as implicated subjects, participants in and beneficiaries of a system that generates dispersed and unequal experiences of trauma and well-being simultaneously. A theory of implication can shed light as well on what Benedict Anderson called long-distance nationalism. The fact that some diasporic groups support exclusivist nationalist projects from afar. In my book, I discuss the example of diasporic Jewish support for Israel, which can take affective, ideological, and material forms. Such diasporic subjects are not so much perpetrators of occupation as what I call perpetuators of a settler colonial project. While committed to exploring a wide range of such examples, I have come to see that an approach to implication and implicated subjects has a particular affinity to questions of race and racism. Forms of violence and inequality premised on racial hierarchy take shape in small-scale encounters and large-scale structures. They are also instantiated repetitively in the present, yet burdened with active historical resonances. Positing the position of the implicated subject offers a lens for addressing these different scales and temporalities of injustice. Taking that position seriously helps us see how binary and hierarchical ideologies, including racism, flourish in the intermediate gray zones of implication and among ordinary subjects who serve, in Simona Forti's words, as transmission belts of domination. Factoring in implicated subjects, however, can also provide levers for rethinking resistance and solidarity across social location. "1989 was a critical year in the collapse of South Africa's apartheid regime, as everyone here knows well. It was also the year that William Kentridge inaugurated a series of charcoal-based works he would call drawings for projection. These handmade animated films, which Kentridge produces with an unusual technique of drawing, smudging, and erasing, provide a powerful but largely indirect response to South Africa's transition and the persistence of post-apartheid inequalities. In a fragmentary, nonlinear narrative, these short films, which currently number 10, tell the tale of the industrialist Soho Eckstein and the artist Felix Teitelbaum, two men who physically resemble Kentridge and serve as dual alter egos in a simultaneously comical and serious reflection on transitional South Africa. I read the indirection of Kentridge's approach and his material engagement with the blurry aesthetic medium of charcoal as deliberate efforts to grapple with the facts of implication on multiple historical and contemporary levels. As a way of continuing to think historical and political responsibility beyond categories of victims and perpetrators, I want to focus briefly on the 1991 film Mine, the third in the Drawings for a Projection series, which followed Johannesburg, second greatest city after Paris, and Monument. Now we know it's Cape Town is actually the greatest city. Johannesburg documents the creation of Soho's empire, including the mining town we associate with the later film, while Monument shows Soho as an ostensible civic benefactor, erecting a statue in honor of the workers. Mine then reveals the underside of Soho's mining empire in no uncertain terms. There's the Portuguese subtitle, which brings out the pun in mine as both possessed, something possessed, and as a mine. After a brief title sequence, the film opens with a scene of metamorphosis in which an explosion in a mine disrupts the landscape and transforms the land into an image of Soho sleeping. The following sequence deploys montage to cross-cut scenes of Soho and the miners beginning their day. The film moves between Soho's domestic and work spaces, shown through Kentridge's drawing erasing technique to be variations on the same space, and the miners' underground work and living spaces, which similarly bleed into each other, as if to demonstrate the workers' complete subordination to the biopolitical regime of racial capitalism. The signature use of charcoal drawing allows Kentridge to unite the spaces of capital and labor, and thus to illustrate their simultaneously dependent and radically unequal nature. But mine also reveals the magical metamorphoses made possible by Kentridge's technique to be complicit with Soho's power to control labor and nature. This is also, in other words, a portrait of the artist as implicated subject. Kentridge's answer to the industrialist's power to control time and space and the natural and human worlds consists not in a refusal of those powers, but in their self-conscious appropriation. Kentridge makes visible what Soho owns but refuses to see. This rendering visible takes place most dramatically in a sequence that begins with Soho's coffee pot, a cafetière as Kentridge calls it. When Soho presses down on the plunger of his coffee, it does not stop at the bottom of the pot, but continues its downward movement through Soho's bed and into the mines below. And I just want to show you a short clip for those who haven't seen this. So here's... Thanks. Okay. So the coffee plunger creates a miniature mine shaft that cuts into the living and workspaces of the miners, through their barracks and showers, and into the cavernous mines themselves. The plunger even passes through the body of one worker, which starts a flow of blood that continues downwards. Once again, Kentridge reveals that his technique partakes of the violence it depicts, an implicit commentary on the implication of the artist in a world of hyper-exploitation. The plunger becomes a kind of drill and is associated with the drilling performed by the miners as well as with the artist's pencil. And the drill cuts into the rock. As the drill cuts into the rock, a strange image soon emerges, recognizable as the cross-section of a slave ship. This first association is then overlaid with the growing sense that the iconography of the mine also resembles a Nazi camp. Indeed, the image of the mine workers' compound seems to be modeled directly on a famous photograph from the liberation of Dachau, one which features a young Elie Wiesel, although Kentridge, who comes from a Jewish family that emigrated to South Africa before the Nazi genocide, claims not to have had the Holocaust in mind at all. I think that is a powerful visual association. Regardless of the artist's intentions, however, recognition of this modeling also casts a dark shadow over the images of miners in the shower, which can now be seen as punning on the habitual reference to the gas chambers as the showers. In this brief sequence, Kentridge creates what I call a multi-directional montage of histories and memories that evoke genocide, slavery, and contemporary capitalism. My interest today, however, is particularly in what mine teaches us about historical and political responsibility. First, I would emphasize that the film locates violence and exploitation on two entangled temporal axes. On the synchronic axis, the film depicts the brutal conditions in the gold mines of the East Rand during the moment of South Africa's transition, as well as the environmental destruction inflicted by mineral extraction. And here's an image from another film very typical of this series and of that landscape. On the diachronic axis, the film evokes relatively distant past through its visual allusions to slavery and the Holocaust. Second, through its intertwining of the synchronic and diachronic, Mine raises questions about historical and political responsibility in the face of large-scale injustices. Soho is clearly an agent of exploitation of people and land, but how do we explain his relation to the deeper histories revealed by the coffee press and the miners' drills? And even more central to my approach, how do we account for Kentridge's relationship to his alter ego? Why does he stage himself through such a persona? Rather than remaining a straightforward, easy indictment of a particularly brutal and unsympathetic capitalist, Kentridge's treatment of Soho and his other alter ego Felix poses more difficult questions. He asked us to think about forms of collective responsibility for impersonal structures and deep histories that accrue not just to obvious perpetrators and other demonic agents, but also to more ordinary subjects, such as the artist himself, his audience, and the complexly situated Jewish community from which he comes. By taking us into the mine, Kentridge submerges us in a moral and political realm of implication. What the movement of the coffee plunger reveals is not simply a historical analogy between different sites of violence, or Soho's or Kentridge's individual unconscious, but rather a complex, connective history of trauma, implication, complicity, and forgetting that defines a social group, South African Jews, caught in what Kentridge once wryly observed as an interesting position between accommodation and marginalization. How can an artist address problems of injustice in such a historical context marked by divergent genealogies and ongoing structural inequalities? For Kentridge, at least, it involves shuttling between the claims of the past and the present and excavating evidence of individual and collective implication from sites layered with multi-directional memory. What does it mean to speak from the position of the implicated subject? Beyond aesthetics, can such a position mobilize a political project? Having evoked the artist as implicated subject, I now want to turn to a second figure of implication, the anti-racist activist. On the evening of February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin, an African-American teenager, was killed by a neighborhood watch vigilante while returning from a convenience store to the home of his father's fiancée in a gated community in Florida. A year and a half later, the killer, George Zimmerman, was acquitted on all charges in the death of the 17-year-old high school student on the grounds that he was acting in self-defense. Together with an unfathomably long list of Black Americans killed by police officers, vigilantes, and white supremacists, the murder of Martin helped spark a major political movement, Black Lives Matter. That long list of murders should also inspire thinking about collective responsibility among those of us positioned as implicated subjects, that is, those who occupy the histories and structures of racial privilege and white supremacy. For those outraged by the killing and subsequent acquittal, a first response was to express solidarity with Martin through acts of identification. Since Martin was killed while wearing a hooded sweatshirt, the hoodie quickly became a symbol of the case and the racist power dynamics that made both the killing and the acquittal possible. Thousands of people posed in hoodies and posted their images on the internet, frequently with an accompanying slogan that declared, "I am Trayvon Martin," or "We are all Trayvon Martin." Such expressions of solidarity via identification have an honorable history in political discourse. In May '68, for instance, French students expressed their solidarity with the allegedly foreign activist Daniel Cohn-Bendit with the slogan, "Nous sommes tous des Juifs allemands," we are all German Jews. Or here, we are all Germans and Jews and Germans. More recently, thousands of Turkish citizens adapted the slogan to the struggle against extreme nationalism and genocide denial by chanting the name of Hrant Dink, the murdered Armenian Turkish journalist. Hepimiz Hrantuz, Hepimiz Ermeniyiz, We are all Hrant, we are all Armenian. Meanwhile, the slogan Je suis Charlie swept the world after Islamists murdered journalists associated with the Parisian satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo, and many people in the US protested Donald Trump's 2017 executive order barring citizens of several Muslim-majority countries from entry into the country by declaring, "We are all immigrants." Such acts of solidarity as identification can successfully mobilize participation and attract attention, but they have clear limits. The claim to universal immigrant status in the United States, for instance, erases the presence of indigenous people and distorts the history of Africans deported to the Americas in the slave trade. No ban on stolen land, a counter slogan to "We are all immigrants," arose from indigenous activists to mark the injustice of both Trump's Muslim ban and the ongoing fact of settler colonialism. When taken up, as it was, by some non-indigenous speakers, the slogan tacitly acknowledges the speaker's own implication in settler colonial dispossessions. In the case of Trayvon Martin, it was not long before criticism arose regarding white Americans' identification with the murdered teen. White people, the convincing argument ran, in my opinion, do not in fact experience the kind of profiling and violence to which black people are daily exposed, nor do they necessarily comprehend the history of racialization and unfreedom, including slavery, Jim Crow, and lynching, that many see as lying behind contemporary experiences. Those who took this critique seriously sought other means of expressing their outrage and solidarity. In shifting away from the discourse of identification, such public rhetoric might have taken up another possible slogan: "We are all George Zimmerman." Such an articulation would have offered one means of taking responsibility for the murder of Martin and for deadly racism. Although less common than alignment with victims, other examples exist of claiming identification with perpetrators as a mode of solidarity. In the wake of the Abu Ghraib revelations during the Iraq War, for instance, the American journalist Mark Danner asserted, "We are all torturers now." Such assertions stay within the logic of identification, but shift their focus from victim to perpetrator. Yet, as Timothy Kaufman Osborne argues in response to claims like Danner's, quote, "Such invocations of collective accountability can end up granting legitimacy to what one seeks to criticize because they help to manufacture the sort of popular sovereign, the we, that is required in order to sustain the apparent legitimacy of the regime," unquote, from Kaufman Osborne. In any event, whether or not such an argument could also be made in the case of a racist murder, this option was not often taken up in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder. Instead, in response to the critique of over-identification and appropriation in the claim, "We are all Trayvon Martin," a new slogan appeared that briefly attained prominence: "We are not Trayvon Martin." This slogan, like "No ban on stolen land," moves us toward recognition of the position of the implicated subject. During the weeks following the acquittal of George Zimmerman in July 2013, a website named "We Are Not Trayvon Martin" published hundreds of short autobiographical texts, sometimes accompanied by photographs. Those declaring themselves not Trayvon Martin were a diverse group. Many of the texts and images came from white Americans recounting experiences of privilege or dawning awareness of being part of a racist society, but there were also posts by black women that drew attention to the gender dimensions of racism and vulnerability, and many posts that raised issues of class and geographical region. As a slogan, "We are not Trayvon Martin" seems at first to flirt with a disidentification that distances its speaker from the victimized teenager. Such a framing also risks keeping the concerns of white people at the center of attention instead of offering a space for people of color to share their experiences. But beyond the fact that the website created a platform for a range of voices and was not meant to displace other possible responses to the events, its mobilization of an explicitly anti-racist rhetoric transformed the potential distancing from the victim into something else. At least in this context, asserting "We are not Trayvon Martin" brings the speaker into proximity with both Martin and Zimmerman without stepping into the shoes of either. Neither identification nor disidentification, the slogan "We are not Trayvon Martin" is rather an occasion to mark another kind of belonging, the speaker's implication in the conditions that contributed to Trayvon Martin's murder. For instance, one post on the website declares, "I am not Trayvon Martin, I am the poster girl for white privilege." This fairly typical contribution illustrates how "We Are Not Trayvon Martin" can create the opportunity to claim a kind of responsibility for Martin's death and for the deaths of many others like him. Yet it is a kind of responsibility that does not fit neatly into the victim-perpetrator binary that frames so much mainstream discussion of racist violence. Instead, contributions to the We Are Not Trayvon Martin website testify to how complexly situated many people are in relation to the racism and racial violence that killed Martin. Consider the comment of another woman on the website who states, "I am not Trayvon Martin because I pass. My father's family is from the Caribbean. My grandmother is of mixed African descent. I have the privilege of sharing my family history when it feels safe to do so, when it will make me seem interesting and exotic," unquote. In this case, but especially for the many self-identified white contributors to the website, the particular form of responsibility at stake involves enmeshment in the hierarchies of racial privilege. As the negative formulation under which those acts take place suggests, however, a clear vocabulary for describing political responsibility beyond that of the criminal perpetrator or direct agent of injustice does not come immediately to mind. In other words, we are not Trayvon Martin, but there's not a positive statement there. Mainstream vocabulary is limited by the assumptions of liberal culture and inadequate to the systemic forms of violence that surround us and that become visible in cases such as that of Trayvon Martin. As a slogan, "We Are Not Trayvon Martin" is an attempt to break with liberal assumptions, but its active negation also suggests the limits of political imagination and organization. The Martin case, as well as the others that have preceded and followed it, indicates the need to reflect on modes of responsibility and justice that exceed the legal frames in which crimes are usually adjudicated. It also demands that we take into account legacies of violence that spread beyond the stable categories of what I call the victim-perpetrator imaginary, a conceptual framework that anchors most explorations of traumatic violence. The acquittal of George Zimmerman heightened the injustice done in the murder of Trayvon Martin. But even if George Zimmerman had been convicted, that conviction would in no way have addressed the scope of racial injustice in the United States that the murder exposes. A limited focus on the trial and the criminal justice system fails to reflect on the figure of political responsibility brought to light by the We Are Not Trayvon Martin campaign, a figure who is neither the criminally responsible agent nor a mere innocent bystander to violence, the implicated subject. This is not a subject who could be indicted by a court. Rather, the implicated subject is an analytical category that can help us understand the kind of society that makes George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin possible. As the historian Jelani Cobb wrote in a column reflecting on the causes of deadly police violence against African Americans, quote, "The police become simply the final and most lethal vectors of a much broader public suspicion of black people," unquote. Within this broader suspicious public can be found those who are neither Trayvon Martin nor George Zimmerman, but whose suspicion and conscious or unconscious investment in white supremacy enable the deadly scenario that unfolded on February 26, 2012, and that continues to unfold daily. If there is a politics to We Are Not Trayvon Martin, it begins here. In making visible the way implicated subjects reproduce the everyday conditions of possibility for systemic racism and thus enable the lethal vectors of perpetration. Simply declaring We Are Not Trayvon Martin does not constitute an adequate politics. But such a declaration opens up a space of reflection that exceeds in crucial ways what could arise from a sole focus on victims and perpetrators, as important as those categories remain. It is best to think of the implicated subject as a position that we occupy in particular dynamic and at times clashing structures and histories of power. It is not an ontological identity that freezes us forever in proximity to power and privilege. In other contexts, we might also, or instead, be perpetrators or victims or descendants of victims. Forms of implication are difficult to grasp, not only because they are complex and shifting, however, but also because they are frequently rendered obscure by means of psychic and social denial. Implicated subjects need not be conscious of their implication. Like Kentridge's plunge into the mines, the Trayvon Martin case also illustrates how the kind of entanglement that the concept of implication helps us name almost always has a diachronic dimension that intersects with a synchronic structure. Implication can emerge from the ongoing and uneven and destabilizing intrusion of irrevocable pasts into an unredeemed present. Nowhere are such intrusions more visible than in the differential vulnerability of racialized subjects such as Trayvon Martin. Part of the reason that a legal approach to racist violence fails to bring out the full dimensions of cases such as the murder of Trayvon is that it can focus only on a discrete recent act and cannot easily address the collective historical legacies of racism that frame that singular event. The echoes of lynching and Jim Crow, for instance, that Martin's killing evokes. An approach through the idea of implication allows these different temporal dimensions to come into focus by drawing attention to the simultaneously historical and contemporary production of the scene of racialization and racial violence. Trayvon Martin's murder and George Zimmerman's acquittal remind us of the need to mourn victims and hold perpetrators accountable. But beyond mourning and criminal accountability, there's a need for a larger reckoning with both the structures of power that undergird such cases and the histories that continue to resonate as aftermaths. Such a reckoning with what Lauren Berlant calls the ordinary of violence cannot take place if the conversation remains limited to victims and perpetrators. Those of us who are white residents of the United States, like myself, but also many others, possess another kind of responsibility. A responsibility to reflect on and act against our implication in systems of racial hierarchy that we enable and in histories of aborted justice that we benefit from in manifold ways. Such forms of implication rarely rise to the level of indictable offense, but confronting them remains an urgent political task. Come to a conclusion. In conclusion, let me return briefly to Arendt. In Collective Responsibility, Arendt criticizes both those, quote, good white liberals who confess to guilt feelings with respect to the Negro question, and those post-Holocaust Germans who cry, we are all guilty. Such claims, she asserts, confuse guilt and responsibility and, quote, only serves to exculpate to a considerable degree those who actually were guilty. Where all are guilty, nobody is, unquote. In addition to exculpating perpetrators, claims that we are all guilty also fail as a response to racism because they end up reproducing the very racialized structure of society that lies behind the problem. Now that we whites are all guilty, their whiteness is reinstantiated. In contrast, collective responsibility, understood as implication, has the potential to break with such homogeneously imagined collectives. The distinction between guilt and responsibility allows us to see again, but in slightly different terms, the productivity of the enunciation, we are not Trayvon Martin. Articulated negatively, the slogan acknowledges the force of racial categorization, but does not reproduce its categories. Hence, not only white Americans embrace the slogan, but also immigrants, women of color, and others. Implicated subjects neither possess an identity nor arise from a process of identification. We are all X. Rather, to be an implicated subject is to occupy a particular subject position in a history of injustice or a structure of inequality. A history or structure one may enter, like an immigrant, long after the injustice at issue has been initiated, or like a beneficiary of global capitalism, far from its epicenter of exploitation. Although some people are consistently and systematically privileged or deprivileged by the intersecting nature of social categories, most people find themselves caught in more complex and ambiguous patterns of power. To paraphrase Primo Levi on the gray zone, the zone of implication possesses an incredibly complicated internal structure, unquote. Attending to this complex structure requires tools such as those developed by feminists of color for the purposes of intersectional analysis. Such analyses track the ways multiple categories, such as race, gender, and class, inevitably interact and condition each other, and thus cannot be thought in isolation. But the wide compass of Arendt's notion of collective responsibility and the particular internal structure of Levy's gray zone, the hybrid positioning of some prisoners as implicated in the terrors of the camps, also highlight a potential pitfall of intersectional approaches. As Jasbir Puar has warned with respect to queer intersectional analyses, attending primarily to the concatenation of multiple forms of oppression may lead to the positing of, quote, an impossible transcendent subject who is always already conscious of the normativizing forces of power and always able to subvert, resist, or transgress them, unquote. Such analyses end up, Puar argues, denying the speaker's own implication in power. Quote, it is precisely by denying culpability or assuming that one is not implicated in violent relations towards others, that one is outside them, that violence can be perpetuated. Violence, especially of the liberal varieties, is often most easily perpetrated in the spaces and places where its possibility is unequivocally denounced, unquote. A theory of implication takes on board the complexity of social categories articulated by intersectional feminism, but it follows Levy, Arendt, and Puar in drawing attention to the uneven way those categories intersect. The fact that, except for some fantasized ultimate victim, most subjects find themselves enmeshed in histories and structures of violence they may not realize they inhabit or help prop up. In Arendt's terms, we may not be guilty of inaugurating those histories and structures, but by virtue of inhabiting them, we may be responsible. A politics of the implicated subject will be one that refuses the moralization of politics by remaining skeptical of assertions of purity. Attending to impurity and asymmetries of power, to implication, in short, may offer our best hopes for recognition, reparation, and reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a poster girl of white privilege of German origins, you've spoken to my heart. I'd like to open the floor for some questions. Yes, please, Homi Baba.
Thank you very much.
Do we have a microphone?
Yeah, it's a little hard to hear.
Can we have any microphone volunteers? Would you like to have a seat? Do you want to stand?
I think I'd rather stand, but
yeah?
if I could put my go like this.
Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking presentation on implication. I'd like you to talk more about different levels of implication. If everybody is implicated in some way or another, I think this actually deals very well with the binary you want to unsettle and the kind of legal imagination that you want to question. But if this is going to be the basis of a politics, we need a jurisprudence. You know, not a legal, not an institutional legal idea, but an ethical jurisprudence to understand how we deal with these different forms of implication. And not a jurisprudence in a court of law, but a jurisprudence as an ethical issue. And I think that's something that made me feel that that in a way, and I may have misheard, by making the distinction between we are not and we are, and giving all the ambiguity on the side of we are not, reproduces a kind of binarism. And that the most radical position that stands with your idea of montage is to put we are not, to create a position between we are not and we are. That, I think, is the most radical, at least as I understand it, just having heard you. That's where I think I learned most by thinking not from the one category to the other, but thinking in between those categories. And there I think there might be the possibility of a complex jurisprudence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, jurisprudence is not a category that I'm myself usually working with, but I'm open to the idea of a jurisprudence beyond, of an ethical jurisprudence beyond the legal, right, beyond the legal institution, and I'm open, that makes sense to me. In terms of, yeah, I think one of the most difficult questions is how do you move from this insight we are not and yet we are implicated to a politics, right? And I don't think that's a simple move, I don't think that's an obvious move. In the book, the trajectory that I try to trace is one toward a rethinking of notions of solidarity and also internationalism. For me, at least, internationalism becomes one way of thinking about how you move from the negative to some sort of in-between positive form. And maybe internationalism would be one version of that. And the cases that I look at are in some ways idiosyncratic, but also in some ways quite, one of them at least, I think quite relevant, which is the idea of internationalism in relation to the Kurdish cause. And I explore another aesthetic project, but one which is also engaged very closely with real politics on the ground, so to speak, which is a project by Hito Steyrl, the German artist, about her friend Andrea Wolf, who was a radical German leftist who joined the Kurdish militants, the PKK, and went and fought in Kurdistan and was killed by the Turkish state. Steyrl is very critical in some ways of the form of internationalism that her friend represents. But she herself, as she pursues this project, moves closer and closer to a new form of what I call critical internationalism. And she ends up actually on the ground in Kurdistan working with artistic collectives, etc. there. And so it's a move from a sense of kind of implication as a German, as a friend of Andrea Wolf, into a kind of internationalist project, internationalist space, which is not defined by identity, but rather by this move toward an internationalism. So I don't know if that fully answers what you're saying, but I think that the trajectory of the project is going in the direction I hope that you are indicating. So thanks for the question.
Thank you. Jen at the back.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Jen Fourie, and thank you, Michael, for a very academic and cerebral presentation. I wonder if you'll permit me to bring an experience as a South African who lost a daughter to the liberation struggle. So I'd like to bring my ancestors into this as well, that a 100-year-old aunt of mine said to me that, you know, of course, that Lindy's death was a sacrifice for all us whites in South Africa. So bringing Kwame Nkrumah's statement that we are not, those who are born in Africa are not Africans. It's the ones for whom Africa is born in them. And I claim that right. So, as whites, and to substantiate what you're saying in a much more practical way, are we going to continue our complicity in every single system that we hold in this country? Justice, education, medical, every single system discriminates against people who are living in poverty. And that's where I feel no guilt, I feel huge complicity. And that's my sense of where we are implicated. By continuing systems that marginalize people without listening and negotiating the kind of systems that would bring them into equality. So my question to white South Africans now is, are we going to wait for land expropriation without compensation to change this incredible situation? And when I even say those words, a primal fear comes up in me and I have to breathe through it. because it's something so deep that I have to call on my ancestors and those present to witness this. And I hope we can do something about it until it's too late, before it's too late. Thank you for hearing me.
Thank you for your comment. It seems to me you've understood very well, so I think that's precisely what's at stake. And I'm an academic, and I think of these things in kind of conceptual analytic terms, also sometimes in aesthetic terms, but for me the importance is to try to link them to very practical experiential issues. And so I appreciate what you've just done for us. Thank you.
I see two last questions, and then we're going to end. Yes, please, and then Jakob. We can try and keep it short so that we can stay with the program.
Thank you very much. I wondered if, I think this follows on from the last question, and I've really gained so much from your work, past and present, and I keep wondering how affect hovers around here, because when you talk about competitive memory versus multidirectional memory, what really strikes me is that competitive memory sort of ossifies and sclerotizes versions of history, and multidirectional memory offers a way of capacitating and mobilizing where for whatever reason, subjects have become immobilized and incapacitated. And it seems to me that some kind of shift of affect, my experience of watching that Kentridge again was very affecting. And so I'm just wondering if you can say something about what's the relationship between shifting our lens to implicated subjectivity and something being affected, and how affect functions there, if that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah, that's a great and difficult question to answer briefly. I mean, I think I try to address it at different points in the book, coming out of an article I published that's reintegrated here in slightly different form called From Gaza to Warsaw, where I kind of break down the notion of multidirectional memory along these two axes, one an axis of comparison, as I call it, one an axis of political affect. And so the affects that are is this on? I can't tell. Okay. The affects that are important for me there, on the one hand, this competitive affect, and then the other one, and I don't, is this an affect of solidarity, right? And that's that mobilizing one that you're talking about there. And so I think that these can, I guess what I've shifted from the last book to this one is both a more differentiated account of multidirectionality as moving in one of those directions, and also the interest in forms of connection that don't just emerge from shared histories of victimization, say Black and Jewish, right, taken as histories of victimization, but also from one's implication in implicity, whatever, other forms of connection to histories of violence, so that one can both inherit histories of victimization and still be implicated in current histories of violence. And that the case I take there is the relation of diasporic Jews to Israel, especially. And that is a very affectively charged form of implication. I don't know that it's as simple as mobilization versus immobilization, because I think ideologies that we don't like are also mobilizing. You know what I mean? So Zionism as a project is an affective ideology. It's a mobilizing one. It might immobilize certain subject positions, so in that sense you could still make a distinction, but I think it would be too easy to say that it's simply one or the other, if you see what I mean. That's only the beginning of an answer, but thanks for the question.
Jakob?
Thank you very much, Michael. I think that, I say this with some trepidation, but also in light of what Jennifer just said, I think that if we are going to involve the question of an ethical jurisprudence, we need to also involve the question of a jurisprudence of law. I think we cannot stop at ethical jurisprudence precisely because the power dynamics that your paper talks to, yes, are so incredibly profound, and especially here, I think we do need the law, and I think that the problem of the implicated subject in South Africa as the beneficiary is also a problem of the failure of the law.
That makes sense to me. And again, the argument is not to simply move fully outside of the law. I'm not suggesting that we, right, again, that we don't hold perpetrators accountable, that we don't need the law as an instrument, what have you. I'm looking for something supplementary, though, to that, right? And then if the law fails, and I think sometimes the law fails in a way which can and should be corrected, but I think it also fails necessarily in other ways, right? That I'm not sure that the law can address all of these kinds of very ethically and politically loaded questions of the sort that arise here, that arise in the US, that arise really everywhere, right? And that is the law alone and the particular models that it's necessarily going to follow are going to be insufficient, which doesn't mean not, so necessary but not sufficient, I suppose would be one way to say it. I'm not a legal scholar, and so I can't speak with great profundity to that question, but my argument is certainly not that we simply abandon that realm or don't think about how it could be transformed, that it would necessarily need to be transformed. But even if it's transformed, it strikes me, it's still insufficient for some of the kinds of larger questions that I'm trying to get at and that I think are important for societies like ours both, right?
I believe I've not seen Professor Rose at the back, so please.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for your paper. If I understand this correctly, one of the critiques of the TRC was that the structural inequalities of apartheid were not addressed, and that the beneficiaries of apartheid were not addressed. And of course, one of the groups that were seen to have been both beneficiaries and to have been structurally implicated in apartheid were the universities. So there was a question raised about what one might call beneficiaries.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you, what does the implicated subject do as a concept that complicity, as we heard in that wonderful intervention from the lady at the back, and beneficiaries doesn't already do?
Right, yeah, thanks. Beneficiaries are included as a version of the implicated subject in the account that I provide. The implicated subject is meant as a sort of umbrella term that includes different forms of implication. I'm sorry, I can't. And I think beneficiary names some of those quite powerfully, but it doesn't name all of them, all of the forms of what I'm trying to call implication. So for example, I think white Americans are the beneficiaries of a long history of racial injustice. I think, for example, though, the case of Israel that I was just evoking from the diasporic perspective, I don't feel I'm a beneficiary of the state of Israel, but I feel I'm implicated, right, in it in various ways, both as an American and as a Jew, in fact, right, in some ways, maybe even more as an American. But the Jewish dimension, because of this powerful affective, ideological interpolation, is also there. So it's partly meant to complement, in some ways supplement the discourse on beneficiaries. I find Mamdani especially helpful in thinking about that. Robert Meister has a really important book called After Evil, where he tries to collapse the perpetrator with the beneficiary, and he's thinking particularly about this critique of the TRC in the South African case. But to me, that doesn't quite work. I want to resist that collapse. And Mamdani, in his short piece, Reconciliation Without Justice, he compares Rwanda and South Africa in a way which I think has really profound implications. He says, what do we do about a situation in which you have, in Rwanda, many perpetrators and few beneficiaries, versus South Africa, where you have few perpetrators and many beneficiaries, relatively speaking. And I think that opens up this kind of plurality of subject positions, and I'm trying to find a framework for thinking through that plurality, I guess. So beneficiary is a powerful and necessary term, but it's incomplete for getting at all the different relations of implication that I'm trying to kind of map, I suppose, would be the way to say it.
Thank you very, very much.